Welcome, dear listeners. As you prepare for a restful night, close your eyes and take a deep breath. Tonight, we will journey with Eamon, a humble shepherd boy whose simple life takes a wondrous turn when he discovers an ancient amulet that awakens dragons and stirs the magic of the world. Let the soothing cadence of this tale wrap around you like a warm blanket, guiding you into a realm of dreams and adventure. Relax, let go of your worries, and allow yourself to drift into a peaceful slumber as we begin. Once upon a time, in a quiet valley nestled between towering mountains, there lived a humble shepherd boy named Eamon. His days were filled with the simple pleasures of tending to his flock of sheep, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the grass, and watching the clouds drift lazily over the snow-capped peaks. Though his life was modest, Eamon never longed for more. He was content with his small cottage on the edge of the village, his sturdy crook in hand, and the loyal company of his dog, Bristle. One bright afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, Eamon led his sheep to graze near the foot of the eastern mountains. The summer breeze was warm, and the day seemed no different from the hundreds before it. But fate, as it often does in such tales, had woven a different thread into the fabric of his life. As Eamon sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree, he noticed something peculiar. Amidst the stones and wildflowers, a faint shimmer caught his eye. At first he thought it was merely a trick of the sunlight, but the glimmer remained, almost as if it were beckoning him closer. Curiosity stirred in his heart, and he rose from his spot, making his way through the meadow. There, half buried in the earth, lay an object unlike anything Eamon had ever seen. It was an amulet, though not of any design he recognized from the village or the markets beyond. The amulet was circular, fashioned from a deep, dark metal that seemed to hum with its own quiet energy. In the center of the amulet was a large shimmering stone, green as an emerald, but flecked with gold, as if the stars themselves had been trapped within. Strange, twisting runes were etched along its edges, symbols that looked ancient and powerful. Eamon knelt down and brushed the dirt away from the amulet's surface. As soon as his fingers touched it, he felt a warmth spread through his hand, traveling up his arm and settling in his chest. It was not the heat of the sun or the warmth of a fire. It was something deeper, something alive. His heart quickened, and for a brief moment he could hear a distant sound, a low, rumbling roar, like the voice of the mountains themselves. Startled, he pulled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Bristle, ever faithful, stood by his side, sensing the change in the air. The shepherd looked around, half expecting the earth to tremble or the sky to darken, but all remained still. Yet the amulet in his hand thrummed with an undeniable energy, as though it were waiting for something. or someone. "What are you?" Eamon whispered to the amulet, though of course it gave no answer. He glanced up at the mountains, feeling an inexplicable connection to the towering peaks, as if they held a secret he had never before been able to see. The roar he had heard still echoed faintly in his mind, growing distant yet ever present. His instincts told him to leave the amulet behind, to bury it once more beneath the soil and walk away. But something in his heart refused. Slowly, almost reverently, Eamon slipped the amulet into his pocket. As he did, the warmth subsided, leaving him with only the gentle hum that seemed to vibrate through the fabric of his clothing. He cast one last glance at the mountains before turning back to his flock, his mind swirling with questions and unease. That night, as the moon rose high over the valley and the stars blinked like old friends, Eamon lay awake in his small cottage. The amulet sat on his bedside table, its stone glowing faintly in the darkness. Every so often, he thought he could hear the roar again, but it was softer now, like a distant storm rolling across the horizon. Little did Eamon know, the amulet he had found was no mere trinket, no ordinary jewel lost to time. It was an ancient relic, forged in a time when dragons roamed the skies and magic still coursed through the veins of the earth. And now, as the amulet rested in his possession, its power had begun to stir once more. Far beyond the valley, in places where the shadows grew long and the winds whispered of forgotten things, the world was changing. And Eamon, the simple shepherd boy, would soon find himself at the heart of a tale that would echo through the ages. For with the amulet, the dragons would return. And with them, so too would those who sought to control their fiery might. The following days passed in a blur for Eamon. Though he continued his usual routine of tending to his flock and roaming the hillsides, he could not shake the strange feeling that had settled over him since finding the amulet. It was as if the world around him had subtly shifted, as if something ancient and immense had begun to stir. Each night, the amulet sat by his bedside, its soft glow filling the small room with an eerie light. And each night, Eamon heard the distant roar growing louder in his dreams. He saw shadows of great wings stretching across the sky, felt the heat of unseen flames licking at his skin. And when he woke in the early hours before dawn, his heart raced as though he had narrowly escaped some terrible fate. It was on one such morning, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, that Eamon noticed something strange. From his perch on the hillside, where he often watched over his grazing sheep, he saw a dark shape in the sky, something large, moving with the grace and power of a predator. At first, he thought it was a storm cloud, rolling in from the mountains, but then it dipped lower, and Eamon's breath caught in his throat. A dragon. Its scales glimmered in the early morning light, dark as onyx, with streaks of gold flashing along its wings. It soared above the valley, its massive body casting a shadow over the land. The air around it shimmered with heat, and the ground trembled faintly beneath Amon's feet. It was not just a dragon from old tales or the dusty pages of forgotten tomes. This creature was real, alive, and it was heading toward him. Amon's heart pounded in his chest as the dragon circled overhead. Its wings beat with the sound of a thunderstorm, and its eyes, glowing a fierce molten amber, seemed to lock onto him. The amulet in his pocket suddenly grew warm, almost hot, and began to hum with energy. Amon fumbled for it, pulling it out just as the dragon descended from the sky, landing with a mighty crash in the field before him. For a moment, all was still. The sheep scattered in fear, bleating as they ran for cover. But Amon stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The dragon was enormous, towering over him like a mountain of scales and muscle. Its breath came in great huffs of smoke, and its eyes gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and ancient wisdom. And then, to Amon's shock, the dragon spoke. "You hold the amulet," it rumbled, its voice low and resonant, like the earth itself was speaking through it. "It has chosen you." Amon could barely find his voice. "Chosen? Me?" he stammered, clutching the amulet tighter in his hand. The dragon lowered its massive head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air around him. "Long have I slumbered beneath the mountains, waiting for the one who would awaken us. The amulet is our bond, and through it, you hold the power to command us, if you are worthy." Amon felt a wave of disbelief crash over him. He, a mere shepherd boy, was now bound to a dragon. It seemed impossible, like a dream too wild to be true. And yet, here stood the dragon before him, solid and real, speaking of ancient bonds and forgotten powers. "I don't want to command anyone," Amon said quietly, fear and confusion swirling in his chest. "I'm just a shepherd." The dragon's golden eyes narrowed. "The amulet does not choose without reason. You may be a shepherd, but you are also more. The dragons have returned because of you. Whether you seek power or not, you must now carry the burden of it." Amon swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the dragon's words settle upon him like a heavy cloak. He looked down at the amulet in his hand, its glow now pulsing in time with the dragon's breathing. Could this truly be happening? Could it be that his simple life had been swept up in something far greater than he could have ever imagined? Before he could respond, the dragon stretched its wings and lifted its head to the sky. "Others will come," it said, its voice a warning. "There are those who seek to control us, to use the amulet for their own dark purposes. You must be ready." With that, the dragon crouched low and with a mighty leap, launched itself back into the sky. Its wings beat powerfully as it soared toward the mountains, disappearing into the clouds, leaving Amon standing alone in the quiet valley. The shepherd boy stared after the dragon for a long time, the amulet still clutched in his trembling hand. His heart raced with 1,000 questions, but only one thought lingered in his mind. The dragons had awakened, and the world would never be the same again. The days that followed the dragon's appearance were like a strange dream for Eamon. He could hardly believe what had happened, yet the memory of the dragon's fiery eyes and the heavy weight of its words clung to him like a shadow. Each time he touched the amulet, a warmth spread through his fingers, reminding him that he had become part of something ancient and powerful, something that both thrilled and terrified him. The people in Eamon's village remained blissfully unaware of the changes unfolding beyond their peaceful valley. They spoke only of the usual matters: the coming harvest, the price of wool, and the occasional rumour of travellers passing through the nearby towns. But Eamon felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Though no one else had seen the dragon, its presence seemed to linger in the air, in the very wind that swept down from the mountains. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky blushed with the colours of dusk, a knock came at the door of Eamon's cottage. It was a soft but firm sound, the kind that spoke of a visitor who knew they would be welcomed. Eamon opened the door cautiously, wondering who could be calling at this late hour. There, standing in the fading light, was an old man cloaked in a deep purple robe, his long silver hair falling in waves past his shoulders. His face was weathered, etched with the lines of time, but his eyes gleamed with a sharpness that belied his years. In one hand, he held a tall wooden staff, topped with a small crystal that shimmered faintly in the twilight. "Good evening, young one," the stranger said, his voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "Might I come in? I have travelled far, and I believe we have much to discuss." Eamon hesitated, but something about the man's presence, calm and commanding, made him step aside. The old man entered, his gaze sweeping the small cottage before settling on the amulet that hung from a simple cord around Eamon's neck. "I see it has chosen you," the old man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The amulet of dragons." Eamon's hand instinctively rose to touch the amulet. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, wary. "And how do you know about this?" The old man smiled faintly. "I am Alaric, a mage who has spent many lifetimes studying the ancient ways. And I know more about that amulet than you might imagine. It is not a trinket to be worn lightly, nor is it a power to be taken for granted." Eamon's heart raced. He had felt the weight of the amulet's power ever since he had found it, but hearing it spoken of by someone so learned made it seem even more real and more dangerous. "What does it want with me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't ask for this." Alaric sighed, lowering himself into a chair by the hearth. "The amulet does not choose by accident. It seeks out those who are worthy, those with the heart to command dragons but not abuse them. But understand this, Aemon. You are not the only one who desires its power. There are darker forces at play, forces that would bend the dragons to their will, and with them, burn the world to ashes. A chill ran through Aemon. Who are they? Alaric's expression darkened. Lord Caelan is one of them. He is a man consumed by ambition, a ruler of dark lands to the east, who has long sought the amulet to command the dragons and extend his dominion. But he is not alone. There are others, mercenaries and sorcerers alike, who would stop at nothing to seize the amulet and use it for their own twisted purposes. They will come for you, Aemon, and you must be ready. Aemon's throat tightened. But how can I fight them? I'm just a shepherd. The old mage leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. You are more than that now. The amulet has bound itself to you, and through it, you have the power to call upon dragons. But power is not enough. You must learn to wield it. I can help you, if you will allow it. Aemon stared into the flickering fire, the weight of the world suddenly pressing down on his shoulders. He had never imagined such a fate for himself. But now, with the amulet pulsing against his chest, he knew there was no turning back. He would have to face whatever was coming, no matter how terrifying it seemed. At last, he nodded. Teach me. Alaric smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. Very well, young one. But remember, those who seek the amulet will stop at nothing to claim it. We must tread carefully, for the path ahead is fraught with peril. And so, as the shadows lengthened outside his door, Aemon began a new chapter in his life under the tutelage of the mysterious mage. Little did he know, the forces gathering against him were closer than he could have imagined, and the battle for the amulet had only just begun. Far away, in the shadowed lands where sunlight struggled to pierce the ever-present clouds, a dark and terrible fortress stood against the horizon like a jagged wound on the earth. This was the domain of Lord Caelan, a man feared across many kingdoms for his ruthless ambition and mastery of dark sorcery. His fortress, Duskfall Keep, was a place where no laughter was heard. No light flickered save for the dull glow of molten iron from the forges that never ceased their toil. And within its towering walls, plans were being made. In the dim light of his throne room, Lord Caelan sat brooding, his fingers drumming against the arm of his obsidian throne. His sharp, pale face was hidden beneath the hood of a black cloak, but his eyes glowed with an unsettling red hue, as though they themselves were embers of a fire that burned deep within him. Before him knelt a man, trembling and cloaked in rags, a messenger who had travelled far to bring news that would change the fate of many. "The amulet has resurfaced, my lord," the messenger said, his voice shaking. "The dragons have begun to stir. It is as you foretold." Caelan's lips twisted into a cold smile. "So, the time has come. Where is it?" "The boy. He is a shepherd from the western valleys. He found the amulet. But he is untrained, my lord. He does not yet understand its power. Kaelin's smile deepened, though it did not reach his eyes. A shepherd? How fitting. Fate has a cruel sense of humour, placing such power in the hands of a fool. No matter. It will be ours soon enough. He rose from his throne, his tall figure draped in shadow, and paced across the room, his boots echoing off the cold stone floor. Behind him, the flickering light of torches danced along the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like serpents. "We must strike quickly," Kaelin continued, his voice a low growl. "The longer the boy holds the amulet, the stronger his bond with the dragons will become. We cannot allow him to gain control over them. They are weapons, old and powerful, meant to serve the will of those strong enough to wield them." As he spoke, a dark figure emerged from the far side of the room. It was Sorsha, the leader of Kaelin's coven of dark sorcerers. She moved like a whisper, her flowing robes of midnight silk trailing behind her as she approached. Her eyes, cold and piercing, glittered with malice as she bowed her head slightly. "My lord," she said softly, her voice like a serpent's hiss. "The boy is not alone. He has a companion, a mage named Alaric. He is wise in the old ways and will not be easy to defeat." Kaelin's eyes flickered with disdain. "Alaric," he spat the name like venom. "The old fool still clings to the past, thinking his dusty knowledge of ancient magic can save the world. He underestimates the power of the amulet. No matter, he will fall like the rest." Sorsha's lips curled into a wicked smile. "Shall we send the mercenaries, my lord? They are hungry for gold and more than eager to shed blood." Kaelin considered this for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Yes," he said finally, "send them. But they must not harm the boy. He is to be brought to me alive. The amulet must remain intact, and for that, the boy's bond with it must remain unbroken, at least until I have what I need." Sorsha bowed her head. "As you wish, my lord. I will send the black blades. They are swift and deadly, and they will not fail." Kaelin turned his gaze toward the window, where the world outside was dark and foreboding, the distant mountains shrouded in mist. "Good. Let them hunt the boy. And once the amulet is mine, the dragons will bend to my will. With their power, I will burn the kingdoms of men to the ground and rise as their ruler." His words were spoken with the cold certainty of one who had tasted victory long before the battle had begun. He could already see it in his mind's eye. The dragons, fierce and untamed, bound to his command, their fire raining down upon the lands that had defied him for so long. And as the flames consumed the world, his name would be whispered in terror from every corner of the realm. Kaelin turned back to Sorsha, his red eyes gleaming. "Go, set the mercenaries upon their task. Soon the shepherd boy will wish he had never found that accursed amulet." Sorsha bowed once more, then vanished into the shadows as silently as she had come, leaving Kaelin alone in the throne room. The Dark Lord stood there for a long moment, his mind churning with plans and strategies, his ambition blazing like a fire that could never be quenched. Far away, in the peaceful valley where dragons had only just begun to stir, Aemon had no idea that the forces of darkness were already moving against him. The hunters had been unleashed, and the battle for the amulet had truly begun. In the quiet valley, far from the looming shadow of Duskfall Keep, Aemon's days were no longer filled with the simple rhythm of shepherding. Under Alaric's guidance, he began to learn the ways of the amulet, how to call upon its power, how to sense the presence of dragons, and most importantly, how to command them with respect, not fear. But though the lessons came, the weight of the amulet hung heavy on Aemon's heart. He was no warrior, no great hero of legend. He was a boy who had stumbled upon a power far beyond his understanding. "Focus, Aemon," Alaric said one afternoon as they stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The sun blazed down from the sky, casting long shadows over the land. The amulet hung around Aemon's neck, pulsing with its strange, ancient energy. Aemon closed his eyes, reaching out with his mind as Alaric had taught him. He could feel the presence of Skara, the dragon who had first appeared before him, soaring far above the mountains. Through the amulet, their connection grew stronger each day, though it still felt fragile, like a thread of silk that could snap if pulled too hard. "I feel him," Aemon murmured, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good," Alaric said. "Now summon him." Aemon hesitated. He had summoned Skara once before, but the fear of his power still gripped him. What if he failed? What if the dragon did not come? Or worse, what if he came and brought destruction with him? But before Aemon could try, a loud, unnatural sound echoed through the valley. The clash of steel, the crackle of fire. He turned quickly, his heart leaping in his chest. Below, in the village, smoke began to rise, dark and thick against the clear sky. "Trouble," Alaric said, his voice grim. He narrowed his eyes toward the horizon, where figures on horseback galloped through the village, their blades flashing in the sunlight. The Blackblades had come, just as Kaelin had promised. "They're attacking the village!" Aemon gasped, his fists clenching in anger. "Kaelin's mercenaries!" Alaric growled. "They've come for you. They want the amulet." Aemon's heart raced. The village, his home, was being attacked because of him, because of this cursed amulet. Without another thought, he sprinted down the hillside, ignoring Alaric's call to wait. As he neared the village, chaos unfolded before him. The Blackblades, merciless warriors clad in dark armor, rode through the streets, cutting down anyone who dared to stand in their way. Homes burned, the flames licking at the sky, and villagers fled in terror. Aemon felt his blood boil. These were his people, his friends, and they were being slaughtered for a power he had never wanted. Aemon's hand instinctively went to the amulet, its warmth spreading through him like a fire. He remembered Alaric's words. He had the power to call the dragons, to protect the village, but the fear of what might happen if he failed gnawed at him. A piercing scream broke through his thoughts. Aemon turned to see a young girl, no older than 10, cowering in the path of a charging mercenary. Without thinking, he raised the amulet to his chest and closed his eyes. "Skara!" he cried out, his voice trembling but strong. For a moment, nothing happened. The ground was still, and the roar of the flames seemed to mock his call. But then, from the sky, came a sound like a great wind, followed by the earth-shaking flap of enormous wings. Aemon looked up, and there, descending from the heavens like a thunderstorm, was Skara. The dragon landed with a mighty crash, his black scales glinting in the firelight, his eyes blazing with fury. The mercenaries halted, their bravado crumbling before the sight of the colossal beast. Skara roared, a sound that rattled the very bones of the earth, and with a single swipe of his massive tail, he sent the black blades scattering like leaves in a storm. Aemon stood frozen, the amulet still clutched in his hand. He had done it. He had called Skara. But the battle was not over. The mercenaries regrouped, drawing their bows and aiming them at the dragon. "Protect the village!" Aemon shouted, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. Skara responded, unleashing a torrent of fire that swept through the air like a blazing river, forcing the mercenaries to retreat. The villagers, watching in awe, began to rally, grabbing what weapons they could find and driving the attackers back. When the last of the Blackblades had fled into the hills, leaving behind only the smoke and destruction of their failed attack, Aemon finally let out the breath he had been holding. Skara lowered his head, his eyes meeting Aemon's with something like respect. "You did it," Alaric said, stepping up beside him, his voice heavy with approval. "You protected the village." Aemon nodded, but the weight of the amulet around his neck felt heavier than ever. He had succeeded, but he knew this was only the beginning. Lord Caelan would not stop, and the next time, the cost might be far greater. The morning after the attack dawned cold and silent. Smoke still clung to the air, curling from the charred remains of homes and barns. Aemon walked through the village, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The Blackblades had been driven off, but not without leaving destruction in their wake. The villagers looked to him now, no longer just a simple shepherd, but the bearer of the amulet, the one who had called the dragons. "Thank you, Aemon," whispered a woman as he passed, her eyes filled with gratitude. Others nodded in quiet reverence. Yet with each step, Aemon felt a growing unease. He had defended his people, yes, But at what cost? The amulet had brought the mercenaries to their doorstep, and though he had wielded its power, it felt more like a curse than a blessing. Alaric approached from the edge of the village, his expression grave. "We must leave," he said softly. "Caelan will not stop here. This was only the first wave. He will send others, stronger forces, and you won't be able to hold them off alone." Aemon frowned, his gaze drifting toward the mountains. "Leave? But the village? I can't abandon them." The old mage placed a firm hand on Aemon's shoulder. "The best way to protect them is to keep the amulet far from here. Caelan's men came for you. If you're gone, they'll have no reason to attack again. There's a place we can go, an ancient city, Dracathis. The amulet was forged there, and its secrets are still hidden in the ruins. You need to learn its full power if you are to stand against Caelan." Aemon's heart wavered. The thought of leaving the only home he had ever known was a heavy burden. But Alaric's words rang true. The amulet had bound him to a greater destiny, and if he stayed, the village would remain in danger. He nodded slowly. "Dracathis, if that's what it takes, I'll go." Within the hour, they were on their way. The villagers watched as Aemon and Alaric disappeared into the distance, Skara flying high overhead, his shadow a protective wing over them. For days, they travelled through forests and over windswept plains, the landscape growing wilder with each passing mile. The road was long and treacherous, and though Alaric spoke often of the ancient city, Aemon could sense a growing tension in the air. The further they went, the more the amulet seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it knew they were nearing something important, something dangerous. On the 7th day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long blood-red shadows across the hills, they arrived at a narrow ravine. Beyond it, nestled between jagged cliffs, stood the ruins of Dracathis. Towering spires jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the remnants of ancient stone walls lay scattered like forgotten bones. The city, once grand and glorious, was now nothing more than a ghostly reminder of a long-lost civilization. "This is it," Alaric said, his voice hushed. "Here, we will find the answers you seek." But as they descended into the ravine, a sense of dread began to creep over Aemon. The ruins seemed too quiet, too still, and the air was thick with a feeling of being watched. Skara circled above, his massive wings stirring the dust. But even the dragon's presence did little to ease the growing tension in Aemon's chest. Suddenly, Alaric halted, turning to Aemon with a grave expression. "There is something I must tell you," he said, his voice low. Aemon frowned. "What is it?" Before Alaric could answer, a sharp whistle pierced the air. In an instant, dark figures emerged from the shadows. Mercenaries, their swords drawn, surrounding them on all sides. Aemon's heart sank. These weren't just any mercenaries. These were Caelan's men, the Blackblades, and they had been waiting. Alaric stepped forward, raising his hands in surrender. "It's done," he said, his voice calm and cold. "I've brought him to you." Aemon stared in shock, his blood running cold. What are you saying?" Alaric turned to him, his eyes hard and unreadable. "Forgive me, Aemon, but Kaelin's reach is vast, and his power even greater. I had no choice. The amulet must be taken from you before it's too late." Betrayal. The word echoed in Aemon's mind like a curse. The man who had guided him, who had taught him, had delivered him straight into the hands of the enemy. His pulse pounded in his ears as the black blades closed in, their dark eyes gleaming with triumph. "You lied to me," Aemon whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Everything. It was all a lie." Alaric's expression softened, though it was too late. "I did what I had to do. But know this, Aemon. The amulet's power is too great for someone like you. You would have been destroyed by it. Better it be in Kaelin's hands, where it can be controlled." Aemon's grip tightened on the amulet, its heat flaring beneath his fingertips. "I won't let him have it," he said, his voice trembling with both anger and resolve. But as the black blades moved closer, and Alaric's betrayal sunk deep into his heart, Aemon realized that escaping would take more than just the will to fight. It would take everything he had, and more. Aemon stood frozen, his heart pounding like the wings of a trapped bird. The betrayal stung deeper than any wound, cutting through him with a pain he had never imagined. Alaric, the man who had guided him, who had promised to help him master the amulet, had sold him to the very forces he had sworn to fight. Now, surrounded by the black blades, Aemon felt the cold grip of fear closing in. The leader of the mercenaries, a scarred man with eyes like steel, stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the fading light. "Hand over the amulet, boy, and we might let you live." Aemon clenched his fist around the amulet. Its warmth pulsed through him, filling him with a surge of defiance. He could feel Skara circling above, the dragon's presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. The bond between them had grown stronger since that first meeting in the valley. And now, in his moment of need, he knew he had to call upon that bond. There was no other way. "Never!" Aemon spat, stepping back, his voice trembling but determined. "I won't let Kaelin take the amulet." The leader sneered, raising his sword. "Then you'll die with it!" But before the black blade could strike, a deafening roar split the sky, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The air crackled with heat as Skara, dark as midnight and fierce as a tempest, descended from the clouds. His wings spread wide, casting a shadow over the ruins of Dracathas. The mercenaries faltered, their faces twisting in terror as the dragon landed with a crash, his claws digging into the earth. Skara's golden eyes blazed with fury, and a stream of fire erupted from his jaws, sweeping across the line of mercenaries. They scrambled to escape the inferno, their weapons clattering to the ground as they fled into the shadows. The leader barely had time to react before the dragon's tail lashed out, sending him crashing into a crumbling pillar with a sickening thud. Alaric, who had stood watching in grim silence, took a step back, his face pale. "Aemon, listen to me," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Skara is dangerous. The amulet..." But Aemon had heard enough. "You betrayed me," he shouted, his anger boiling over. "You told me to trust you, and now you hand me over to Kaelin like a piece of gold for the taking. You don't deserve to speak of the amulet." The mage's eyes flickered with regret. But the time for words had passed. Skara, sensing Aemon's rage, turned his fiery gaze upon Alaric. The dragon's chest heaved, smoke curling from his nostrils. Aemon could feel the creature's anger, wild and untamed, pulsing through their bond. "Don't!" Aemon cried, raising his hand. He didn't want to see Alaric destroyed despite everything. There had been a time, however brief, when he had believed the mage to be his ally. But Skara's wrath was not so easily calmed. With a mighty roar, the dragon surged forward, his wings kicking up a whirlwind of dust and debris. Alaric barely had time to raise a shield of magic before the dragon's flames engulfed him. The old mage stumbled, his spell faltering under the sheer force of the attack, and for a moment, it seemed he would be consumed by the fire. "No!" Aemon shouted, desperation rising in his chest. He grabbed the amulet, feeling its power surge through him. "Skara, stop!" The command rippled through the air like a shockwave, and Skara froze, his flames sputtering out as he turned to Aemon. The dragon's eyes, once blazing with fury, now softened, as if he understood. Aemon's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he had just done. He had stopped the dragon's attack. He had commanded him. Alaric, battered and singed, staggered back, his face a mixture of fear and awe. He looked at Aemon, his expression twisted with guilt. "You've grown stronger," he murmured. "But you don't know what you're up against, boy. Kaelin will come for you himself, and when he does, not even the dragons will save you." With those words, Alaric turned and fled into the shadows, vanishing into the ruins like a ghost. Aemon watched him go, his mind swirling with a storm of emotions. The mage had betrayed him, but part of him still felt the sting of pity for the old man. Whatever debt had driven Alaric to Kaelin's side, it had cost him more than he could repay. Skara lowered his massive head, nudging Aemon gently as if to reassure him. The bond between them pulsed stronger than ever now. Aemon ran a hand along the dragon's scales, feeling the warmth beneath his fingertips. "Thank you," he whispered. The dragon huffed softly, his great golden eyes watching Aemon with something like trust. Aemon knew then that their bond was no longer just a matter of magic. It was one of understanding, of respect. They were no longer just a shepherd and a dragon. They were partners, bound by fate. But even as the flames died down and the ruins fell silent once more, Eamon knew the battle was far from over. Caelan was coming, and with him, a force darker and more powerful than anything he had faced. He would need more than just Skara's strength. He would need to master the full power of the amulet before it was too late. The ruins of Dracathas lay still beneath the pale light of the rising moon. Eamon stood at the edge of the ancient city, Skara beside him, their breath visible in the cool night air. The once grand towers now stood as crumbling monuments to a forgotten age, and the silence that draped over them seemed unnatural, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Eamon knew the calm would not last. Far in the distance, beyond the hills and the dark forests, a storm was gathering. Not of wind and rain, but of men. Caelan's forces. His army, led by the most ruthless of his generals, was marching toward Dracathas, and with them came the dark sorcerers who served Caelan's will. Eamon could feel the pull of the amulet, as if it sensed the coming clash, its power thrumming beneath his skin like a heartbeat. He turned to Skara, the dragon's golden eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "Are you ready?" Eamon whispered, though the question was as much for himself as it was for his companion. Skara rumbled softly, lowering his great head to nudge Eamon. The dragon's trust gave him strength, but deep inside, Eamon felt the weight of the impossible task before him. Caelan's army was vast, his magic dark and ancient. How could one boy and a dragon hope to stand against it? Alaric's warning echoed in his mind. Caelan will come for you himself, and when he does, not even the dragons will save you. But there was no time for fear. The amulet glowed brightly now, as though it were readying itself for the battle to come. Eamon could feel its power humming, urging him forward. He had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. As dawn broke, the first wave of Caelan's army appeared on the horizon. A dark, menacing force, marching in perfect unison. Banners bearing Caelan's crest fluttered in the wind, and at their head rode the Blackblade generals, their armor gleaming black as night. Behind them, the sorcerers rode silently, their robes trailing like shadows behind them. Eamon swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never seen anything like this, a force of sheer terror, a storm of steel and sorcery that seemed ready to sweep him away. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for the village, for the people he loved. He had to stop Caelan. He mounted Skara, the dragon's massive wings spreading wide as he leapt into the sky. Together they soared above the ruins, the wind whipping through Eamon's hair. From above, he could see the full scale of the army that marched toward them. Rows upon rows of soldiers, their armor glittering in the morning light. "Skara," Aemon whispered, gripping the amulet tightly. It's time. With a great roar, Skara dove toward the army, flames licking from his jaws. The fire streaked across the sky like a comet, crashing into the ranks of soldiers below. They scattered, their perfect formation breaking as they scrambled to avoid the dragon's wrath. Aemon felt the power of the amulet surge within him, connecting him to the dragons of old. He called upon the ancient bond, feeling the magic pour through him as though it had been waiting for this moment. From the distant mountains, other dragons answered his call. Great beasts with scales of emerald and sapphire, their wings thundering as they joined the battle. The sky darkened with the shadows of dragons, their roars shaking the very earth. Aemon's heart soared with them, his fear replaced by a fierce determination. This was what the amulet had been meant for, not for destruction, but for protection, for balance. Kaelin's forces, once so confident in their victory, now faltered. But the dark sorcerers were not so easily undone. They raised their hands, chanting in unison, and from the earth rose great black tendrils of smoke and shadow, twisting and writhing like serpents. The magic crackled through the air, striking at the dragons with deadly force. Aemon gasped as he felt the weight of the dark magic, the power of it pressing against him like a vice. He reached for the amulet, but the shadows were relentless, creeping toward him, threatening to choke the life from him. But Skara roared once more, his wings beating with renewed strength. The dragon turned toward the sorcerers, his eyes blazing with fury, and unleashed a torrent of fire that broke through the shadowy tendrils, searing them to ash. The sorcerers shrieked, their magic faltering as they fell beneath the dragon's flames. Yet even as the battle raged, Aemon knew the true threat had yet to reveal itself. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a figure appeared on the battlefield, shrouded in darkness. Lord Kaelin. The Dark Lord rode upon a great black horse, his armor gleaming with an unnatural sheen, his eyes glowing a deep crimson. He raised his hand, and the air around him twisted with dark energy. With a single gesture, he unleashed a wave of magic that sent dragons tumbling from the sky, their roars of pain echoing across the battlefield. Aemon's heart clenched as he saw Skara falter, the dragon struggling to stay aloft. Kaelin's power was immense, more terrible than he had imagined. But this was the moment he had prepared for. The amulet blazed with light, its magic pulsing through him, and Aemon knew what he had to do. He urged Skara forward, toward the Dark Lord, and with a cry that echoed across the battlefield, he raised the amulet high, its light piercing through the dark magic. The final battle had begun. The battlefield had become a storm of fire and shadows, with dragons roaring and soldiers shouting, their cries swallowed by the clash of magic. Aemon clung tightly to Skara as the dragon soared through the sky, dodging the tendrils of dark magic that crackled around them. Below, Lord Kaelin stood in the heart of the chaos, his crimson eyes fixed on Aemon with a gaze that could pierce the soul. Aemon's pulse pounded in his ears as he faced the Dark Lord. Kaelin's power rippled through the air, a force so dark and ancient it made the earth tremble beneath his feet. Skara let out a defiant roar, but even the mighty dragon seemed dwarfed by the terrible magic swirling around Kaelin. This was no ordinary enemy. This was a force born of shadows, of centuries of dark sorcery, and it was coming for him. As Skara circled above, Aemon felt the amulet grow hot against his chest, its glow intensifying with every passing second. The dragons that had answered his call flew with him, their scales shimmering like precious gems against the dark sky. But even their strength seemed small in the face of Kaelin's dark magic. Aemon's heart raced. He could feel the power of the amulet coursing through him, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not like this. The amulet could command the dragons, but it could not defeat the darkness that Kaelin wielded so effortlessly. He had to make a choice, and he knew, deep in his soul, what it must be. Aemon! Kaelin's voice rang out across the battlefield, cold and sharp like a blade cutting through the wind. Do you think you can win? The amulet is powerful, yes, but it cannot save you. It was never meant for you. Give it to me, and I will spare your life. Aemon's grip tightened on the amulet. He had heard those words before, from Alaric, from the mercenaries, and now from Kaelin. All of them sought the amulet's power, not understanding the true cost of wielding it. Aemon had learned, through his bond with Skara and the dragons, that the amulet was more than a weapon. It was a connection between him, the dragons, and the ancient magic of the earth. And he knew what had to be done. Skara let out another roar, diving toward Kaelin with flames bursting from his jaws. The Dark Lord raised his hand, summoning a shield of shadow that absorbed the dragon's fire. Aemon could feel the strain in Skara, the pull of the battle taking its toll, and he realized that this fight could not be won by strength alone. With a deep breath, Aemon guided Skara higher into the sky, away from the battlefield, until they hovered above the ruins of Dracathus. The wind howled around them, carrying the sounds of battle up from below. The amulet burned against Aemon's chest, pulsing with energy, and he knew that its time had come. "Thank you," Aemon whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "For everything." Skara turned his great head toward Aemon, his golden eyes filled with understanding. The dragon seemed to know what Aemon intended, and there was no fear in his gaze, only trust. Aemon raised the amulet high above his head, feeling its power surge through him one final time. His heart ached with the weight of the decision he was about to make, but he knew there was no other way. The amulet's power had caused all of this. The awakening of the dragons, the rise of Kaelin, the battles and betrayals. And now it was time to end it. With a cry that echoed through the skies, Aemon brought the amulet down and smashed it against the ancient stone of Dracathis. A blinding light exploded from the amulet, spreading across the sky in waves of shimmering brilliance. The sound of the shattering echoed through the mountains, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Aemon could feel the magic unraveling, the bond between him and the dragons fading, but not breaking. The amulet's power was being released, its energy scattering into the winds, no longer bound to any one person. Below, Kaelin staggered, his dark magic faltering as the light washed over him. His eyes widened in disbelief as the power he had sought for so long slipped through his fingers. He let out a roar of fury, but it was too late. The darkness that had clung to him for centuries dissolved into the air, leaving him powerless. Skara let out a triumphant roar, and the other dragons followed, their voices ringing out in celebration as the battle came to an end. The mercenaries fled, their leader's defeat leaving them scattered and broken. The ruins of Dracathis stood silent once more, but this time there was peace in the silence. Aemon slumped against Skara's back, exhaustion flooding his body. The amulet was gone, its power no longer a burden on his heart. He had done it. He had saved the dragons, the village, and the world from Kaelin's dark grasp. But more than that, he had learned the true meaning of the amulet's magic: trust, respect, and the bond between those who shared its power. As the sun rose over the mountains, casting golden light over the ruins, Aemon knew that his journey had changed him. He was no longer the simple shepherd boy he had once been. He was something more, a guardian of the ancient magic, a protector of the bond between dragons and men. Skara lowered his head, nuzzling Aemon gently. The bond between them, though no longer tied by the amulet, remained strong. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Aemon smiled, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on his face. It was a new beginning, not just for him, but for the world. And though the amulet was gone, the legend of the shepherd and the dragons would live on, a tale whispered in the winds for generations to come.